Good afternoon, everyone. Good day, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. I'm Ann Kurth. I'm the Dean of the Yale School of Nursing, and I'm really delighted to welcome each of you to the Global Health Conversation Series. Sponsored by the Yale Institute for Global Health, YIGH, this series is a venue for our community to learn from and connect with innovative leaders in global health. In addition to YIGH, we are indebted to the George Herbert Walker Jr. Lecture in International Studies at the Whitney and Betty McMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale for co-sponsoring the series, including today's event. I'm so pleased to be able to welcome the over 700 people who've registered for today's event, including faculty, students, and alumni of Yale University, colleagues at the UN Development Program, and at Permanent Missions to the UN in New York, and the general public. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. As we are all seeing more and more and experiencing, Earth's life-sustaining ecosystems are being undermined, threatening human health, other species' health, development, and survival. While we have seen increases in the lifespan and declines in child mortality and notable reductions in poverty, these advances are being undermined by climate change, deforestation, loss of arable land, freshwater depletion, ocean acidification, and pollution. Today's conversation will focus on the critical issue of planetary health, which stresses the urgent need to better understand relationships between these global-scale impacts and population health, and to develop strategies and policies to lessen these impacts, repair natural systems, and maintain the planet in a state that is conducive to optimal population health. Planetary health has become an increasingly important area at Yale with a variety of initiatives across the campus. Through YIGH, we have recently launched a Planetary Health Network, which brings together faculty members from across the university who are passionate about planetary health to collaborate on research projects and knowledge-sharing initiatives. Please look to the YIGH website if you're interested in learning more or joining this network. In addition, the university has launched the Planetary Solutions Project, which draws on Yale's repository of world-class knowledge, innovation, and leadership to address human-caused environmental change and crises. Building on this effort, we are so pleased to have with us today Achim Steiner, Administrator of the UN Development Program. For nearly 3 decades, Administrator Steiner has been a global leader on sustainable development, climate resilience, and international cooperation. To formally introduce Administrator Steiner, I'll now turn to my colleague, Dr. LaRon Nelson.
Hello, everyone. My name is LaRon Nelson, and I am the Associate Dean for Global Affairs and Planetary Health at the Yale School of Nursing. Today, I am pleased to be joined by my fellow co-moderator, Dr. Robert Dubrow, Professor of Epidemiology at the Yale School of Public Health and Faculty Director of the Yale Center on Climate Change and Health. Thanks for being here today, Rob. Dr. Dubrow and I are also the co-leads of the Yale Institute for Global Health's Planetary Health Network. And we are excited that today's event will spark new ideas and interests on this critically important issue. It is my pleasure to introduce today's distinguished guest, Achim Steiner, Administrator of the United Nations Development Program. Over his entire career, he has worked tirelessly to champion sustainable development, green economy, and international cooperation, and has been a vocal advocate of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. Administrator Steiner has served across the United Nations system, looking at global challenges through the sustainable development lens. Between 2006 and 2016, he led the United Nations Environment Program, the UN's leading environmental authority that sets the global environmental agenda. In 2017, he was elected by the United Nations General Assembly to head the United Nations Development Program, which works with 170 countries to support poverty eradication and inclusive society. Achim Steiner previously held other notable positions, including Director of Oxford Martin School, Director General of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and Secretary General of the World Commission on Dams. In December of last year, the United Nations Development Program launched its Human Development Report 2020, which lays out a stark choice for world leaders. Take bold steps to reduce the immense pressure that is being exerted on the environment and the natural world, or humanity's progress will stall. The report argues that as people and planet enter an entirely new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, or the age of humans, it is time for all countries to redesign their paths to progress by fully accounting for the dangerous pressures humans put on the planet and dismantle the gross imbalances of power and opportunity that prevent change. During today's conversation, I look forward to discussing the report and the important issue of planetary health. Please join me in welcoming Administrator Steiner.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean Kurt, dear Professor Nelson, dear Professor Dubrow. I assume that this is where I simply take off and jump in unless somebody stops me. And let me begin by thanking you all for this wonderful invitation, the opportunity to spend an hour and a half with you and some of your faculty and others who are interested in this topic of planetary health. And I want to thank both the Dean and Professor Nelson for the very kind introduction, because what in a sense prompted, I think, us to focus on this issue of planets, people and prosperity and planetary health has really come into focus, particularly through our world of UNDP, through the Human Development Report we published for 2020. And for those of you who may not be so familiar, UNDP is the United Nations Development Program. It's at the heart of the UN development system. It's the entity that works in 170 countries on the major development issues of our time, but is also an organization that, obviously, with the experience it assembles from so many different frontiers of development across the world, tries to sometimes bring into focus the challenges and perhaps the horizons against which we need to think about the future of development. And so the topic of planetary health and the theme of our 2020 Human Development Report coincide very neatly, because they both recognize that we are at an inflection point. And that inflection point comes down to something very common sense-like. You sometimes have to wonder why it took us so long to realize that human health and environmental health are inextricably linked. Everybody knows this from a kind of locational experience. Pollution is something that we have known for hundreds of years, and we know that pollution and environmental condition clearly affects human health. But over time, we have also begun to realize that it's not just a locational issue. It used to be an issue of urban geography, to those of you who maybe have studied geography in your lives, where if you look particularly in the United Kingdom at the settlement patterns and urbanization patterns, the wealthy always lived upwind of an industrial factory or industrial infrastructure, and the poor lived downwind. Already there you saw the impact of pollution, inequality and quality of life, including the impact on health of people, very clearly manifested in a way that today really has taken on a planetary dimension. And if I may just fast forward a little bit and take another example of pollution that already 40 years ago began to preoccupy us: ozone depleting substances, destroying that very thin film of ozone, the ozone layer around our planet Earth, and our recognition that we had to phase out these ozone depleting substances in order to avoid what was already beginning to be manifestly a planetary health problem: a hole in the ozone layer, increased number in cancers, skin cancers, premature death. And so the toll, the numbers, and the empirical evidence continue to mount about how environmental, not just destruction, but also environmental impacts clearly were linked to human well-being. Fast forward a little bit, because this is the sort of common sense entry point, but today we live in a time, and Professor Nelson just alluded to it, we have taken this notion of living in the age of the Anthropocene as a way of trying to reconceptualize quite how significant the impact of humans is. Anthropocene, the age of humans, is a simple way of expressing an immensely complex set of changes and developments that are underway. But using the term Anthropocene, and it is not yet an accepted one in the geological sense of an age or an era like the Holocene, but scientists and bodies are currently debating whether indeed the notion of living in the age of the Anthropocene after the Holocene does make sense. And what it really implies is two things. One, the nature and scale of the impact of humans on the planet has become geologically traceable. We are now the dominant species on this planet. We are changing its atmosphere, its biosphere. We are changing the composition of the the quality of water, the quality of air, and many other elements that signal to us that this is a qualitatively and quantitatively different dimension in which we need to think about the presence of Homo sapiens, the human species, so to speak, on the planet. And to some, this is obviously very much a narrative associated with the Doomsday scenario. But let me very quickly try and counter that notion. Yes, it is a way of understanding quite how significant our collective impact is on this planet today, and by implication and by consequence on future generations. But it is also a way of trying to focus on the fact that we have choices. Never in human history before have we had the wealth, the science, the knowledge, the technology, the possibilities of choosing different pathways, and therefore living in the age of the Anthropocene is not inevitably a doomsday scenario. On the contrary, it is an era of choices, and choices with consequences that are intergenerational. Now, very quickly, fast forward to how we have measured human progress, because part of the planetary health notion, people, planet, prosperity, has basically been this very simplistic way that essentially it is through economics, through money, through wealth, through gross domestic product, per capita GDP, that we have spent the better part of 100 years of measuring human progress, human development. And it was that led in about 30 years ago, UNDP, to challenge this notion that the best way to measure progress and development was to do so through this economic narrow lens. That's when the Human Development Report was first conceived of by very inspiring and forward-looking economists, Professor Amartya Sen, Mahbub al-Haq, and many others, who came up with the Human Development Index. And in its simplest form, it was a way of expanding the lens, introducing health and education as additional parameters for measuring human progress, and very deeply rooted in the notion of capabilities to succeed as a human being. Now, we still as a world continue to measure progress almost exclusively through this GDP lens. And it is one that has led us essentially to the point where today you could argue we are truly missing the point. Namely that people, planet, and prosperity have a far more intricate relationship, and decisions need to evolve far more rapidly in order to ensure that human well-being and the corollary of planetary well-being, of planetary health, need to be managed in sync. We need to measure progress differently. We need to take different decisions. And this is why in 2020, our Human Development Report chose the new frontier, the next frontier in human development, as being related precisely to this issue. We introduced a new planetary adjusted human development index that tried to capture the health of the planet through the impacts that we're having as humans, combined with the traditional human development index. It's an experimental index. We have put it out there for the world to consider, but we believe it is perhaps the best way in which we can currently give expression to this notion of planetary health and its links to human health. Now, in its consequences, and I'll end with that, is the simple recognition, and Bobby Kennedy once put it very simply. He says that GDP measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile. And it is that search for a way in which we can take a common sense realization, an intuitive understanding that underpins that notion of planetary health, and translate it into measurable and empirically validated foundations, because that is how we make public policy. That is how we trade off choices in different contexts. And much of what UNDP does today, not least in the midst of a COVID-19 crisis, is to help countries conceive of a development pathway out of this crisis, building forward better. Now, it's easily proclaimed, it is easily stated. How do you do it? You have to make policy choices about the fiscal policy systems, taxation systems, because here is the first distortion. Our markets are not operating rationally. They subsidize things that harm us and essentially harm ultimately prosperity, and tax the good decisions that people take. This is the taxation system of the early 21st century. We tax labor through high income taxes, but we hardly tax pollution. This is not rational in this age, and it is fundamental to understanding why we have come to a point where planetary health has become such a challenge. We need to look also at the way that inequality intersects with planetary health. The fact that research showed us some years ago that when lead was still being put into petrol, with the argument that essentially that was a price we had to pay for affordable mobility, It was the poor who lived by the roadsides of the main highways that were most affected by lead in petrol. And it was the children of poor people who had far higher levels of lead in their bodies than children of wealthier families, because they lived further away from the highways, they had gardens, they lived in leafier suburbs. Simple illustrations of how inequality and environmental impacts and human health interface. Let me end by just saying, because I look forward very much to the questions and the discussions that we have, that in a world of the 21st century, in thinking about the future of development, which is so much the focus of UNDP's work today and that of the United Nations system in helping a very unequal world and a very stressed world to find together a better way forward, using the Sustainable Development Goals that many of you will have heard, not as some metric, but rather as a compass on which we can together address a reset, a recalibration of the yardsticks of human progress, and ultimately enable us to realize a very simple fact. Prosperity is about people and not about money. We measure prosperity in monetary terms, but actually what we really mean is, are people able to fulfill their aspirations in life? And so to demonetize to some extent, not to ignore that dimension, but to demonetize it to some extent and to complement it with an understanding of how much people therefore also depend on the planet for their well-being, and how the way we consume and produce and exercise our economic choices ultimately shapes the nature of our planet and its ability to sustain us, is at the heart of rethinking people, planet, and prosperity in our age. Thank you so much, and Professor Nelson, back to you.
Hi. So actually, this is Robert Dubrow, so it's back to me. So yeah, thanks, Administrator Steiner, for some very insightful comments. And building on those comments, I wanted to ask the first question. So I and Dr. Nelson will ask a couple of questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So the first question is, and you dealt to some degree with this already, so I was wondering if you could elaborate. What is the scope and scale of human pressures on the planet? And importantly, how do social imbalances and inequality contribute to the problem?
Well, I gave you a couple of parameters already, but just to give you a sense, let me, for instance, give you a couple of more indicators of the scale, for example. If you realize that the total mass of things humans have made, like buildings, roads, bottle tops, plastic bags, now exceeds the total mass of all living things on our planet, it gives you one sense of the anthropogenic impact we have had, of the sheer scale of what we have. And there are some wonderful other analogies about chicken bones, for example. Few people realize that chickens are the most mass-produced consumable livestock in the world. And if you were to add up all the chicken bones ever consumed, extraordinary mountains would be found on planet Earth. But let me also give you a sense of quite how dark some of these statistics have become, particularly in the last 100 years. We have destroyed well over 50% of the world's wetlands in just half a century, in the name of progress, in the name of development, in the name of useless environmental assets that are not being put into productive use. We have dammed most of the world's rivers with the argument that the ingenuity, human ingenuity of building dams to produce electricity, irrigate lands, always outweighs the ingenuity of nature that has given us these extraordinary riverine and hydrological ecosystems that have such extraordinary functions in our planetary context, but also in terms of humanity's survival. And water is another very good example and metaphor through which to look at the kind of situations we have created for ourselves. In a country like Australia today, the Murray-Darling Basin is a river basin where most of the water is now traded. It is traded and it is no longer used for farming, but in fact, farmers trade their water rights to the urban city municipalities in order to ensure that these municipalities have enough water to provide drinking water to the urban population. We are reaching in so many aspects and also parts of the world planetary boundaries. It's a concept that has emerged in recent years, and I think provides us with a very useful way of understanding what is the boundary condition after which you're no longer dealing with the planet's ingenious systems of producing what we need to survive on it, but you're depleting the capital stock, so to speak, and you're destroying the capability of nature to sustain us. And another horrendous statistic is that roughly 70%, 70, of the world's wildlife may have been lost in the past 50 years. Add to that climate change, that we are just a few years away from passing the point at which carbon emissions accumulated in the atmosphere are going to move beyond the point of no return in terms of a 1.5 degree warming scenario, i.e., for generations, probably hundreds of years, people will no longer have even the option of trying to get back to a world that maybe has warming below 1.5 degrees. No, it is then essentially a reality, out of control. These are some of the parameters within which I think we can begin to comprehend the scope and scale of change. And that is why I often say we are the first generation of the Anthropocene, where truly we have begun to understand that we are changing the atmosphere and the biosphere on this planet. Inconceivable to our grandparents, a reality and a very stark one to our children already.
Administrator Steiner, I wasn't prepared for that chicken bone example. I have to say, I feel personally responsible for that particular challenge, but let me say,
most of us are.
In the Human Development 2020 report, it was stark how it laid out how calamities are really the product of this, concept of people and planet being out of sync. Talk to us about how COVID-19 is an example of this imbalance between human and planetary health, and also what have we learned from it, and how can we be prepared for the next pandemic calamity?
To me personally, the pandemic has been a stark reminder of something that maybe 20 years ago really led me to focus on the link between environment and development, or environment and human well-being, in ways that maybe when I was studying at university, as a development economist, had not really been at the forefront of my mind. And that was the realization that in so many ways, at this point in time, we are confronted with choices that, yes, in some respects, still must be based on imperfect knowledge. But this is where I sometimes have often struggled with the debates about climate change, because this notion that we will only decide to do something when we have perfect knowledge goes against everything that we have learned in human history. And whoever in life has the privilege of having perfect knowledge and foresight in order to take a decision? And I think it is that conundrum in which we find ourselves, namely the necessity to act with sufficient information to make us more cautionary about what comes next, and yet not having a guarantee that the solutions we have will work. COVID-19, first of all, is a perfect illustration of the latter. So many decisions had to be taken in a number of days. So often we got it wrong. So often we paid a price, which in hindsight, you ask yourself, how could this have happened? The second big lesson is, I think we need to realize that preparedness is not a luxury. And, if you just take the numbers today, the cost of this pandemic alone is about 500 times as much as a pandemic prevention measures combination would have cost us if we had taken them in time. And probably that number is an underestimate, because we did not take this thing seriously, despite the fact that we had SARS, we had Ebola, we had enough illustrations about how zoonotic diseases can jump from the animal kingdom, so to speak, into human bodies. This is not something that has happened for the first time to us. It has happened to us time and again in history, but now we are in the 21st century. And here, I think there is the added dimension that with travel, with global trade, but also with the interdependence that we have built up, we are so much more vulnerable, physically, economically, and socially. And I think it is this combination of realities that I think is making us all reflect far more deeply about what will life be like following COVID-19. And let's always remind us that we are still in the midst of this crisis. Yes, some countries are now vaccinating ahead of others, but just the vaccination dilemma is already an illustration of how difficult we are finding it to act as a global community when we know that we're going to lose this battle against the virus if we cannot vaccinate everyone. And yet look at the statistical reality of who is getting vaccinated right now and who is not. This is one of the illustrations of what we mean by acting against our own interests. This is not rational, and this is the price we are paying for not taking the notion of resilience seriously. And the relationship between nature and human well-being is not only, I think, illustrated in this instance by a virus that has moved into our lives in such a brutal way. It is the realization that so much of what has happened in the last 50 to 100 years in particular, because that's where all the curves went up exponentially, deforestation, pollution, destruction of wetlands, etc., soil fertility that is being lost, ocean acidification. These are all drivers of greater environmental change and ultimately vulnerability. And I think the more we are able to see these systems interact, the more we recognize that we are actually entering into an age of extreme vulnerability and even more so of a lack of preparedness. And therefore resilience becomes more elusive rather than something that we have built, at a moment in time when science, technology, and wealth for that matter would have suggested otherwise.
Yeah, thank you, Administrator Steiner. I wanted to turn to how we actually affect change. So the question is, how can we encourage policymakers and legislators to consider the impacts of planetary health? How can we incentivize positive change and innovations at all levels, at the local, domestic, regional, and global?
Again, at the risk of oversimplification, but as a first starter to respond to your question, I think there are a number of drivers that ultimately will determine how a society makes choices. And the first one has to be informed and empowered citizens. I think whether, even if you're living in a more autocratic regime or you're living in the ideal democracy, which probably is also an elusive aspiration, perhaps in the minds of many, informed and empowered citizens are ultimately the base upon which you can both transact and develop different policy choices. And I think one of the great things of our time is that if even if I look at the generations that are now coming after us, kids who are 5, 10, 15-year-old today, they live in an age where information and the ability to understand more about what is happening to the world, not just around you, where we perhaps who grew up still in a very isolated family or rural community might have found ourselves in the 60s or even 70s. Today, for many children around the world, understanding that there is a world out there and that they are part of it comes so much more naturally. And I think therein lies one of my reasons for being an optimist, because I do believe that informed and empowered citizens do act differently. And, just take the example of Fridays for Future. And here we are in a moment in time where 13, 14, 15-year-olds have essentially taken charge of the most central challenge of our time, climate change. Not only has it opened the eyes and opened conversations in virtually every country in a different way, they are leading the debate, and they are leading it with a clarity of purpose and understanding that I must say I'm sometimes envious when I compare my daily life sitting in United Nations conferences and looking at how we sometimes try to transact despite what we know. But this is the second part, and herein lies, I think, a critical understanding. Our economies are foundational to what sustains us. It drives our ability to, ultimately have employment, have food, access to electricity, healthcare, and so on. So how our economy sends signals and in which direction it encourages consumption and production or discourages it is critical. One, taxation and fiscal policy we still live in an age where, as I mentioned earlier on, we subsidize things that we know based on science and evidence are harmful, but because of legacy interests, because of the inertia in our economies, because of economic power being vested in perhaps a few who have a lot to gain from the status quo, we are not acting on knowledge. We are keeping an economic system going that essentially has to shift, whether you call it a green economy, a more equitable economy, that social contract in which governments essentially shape the economic rules of the game needs to evolve. And fiscal policy, taxation, fossil fuel subsidies, these are just some egregious examples of where we need to focus on. And it ultimately comes down to how financial markets will view the future. Financial markets, I think, are often viewed as this sort of, untamable, dinosaur or monster, when really financial markets at their simplest are fairly mercenary. Where you can make money, you will go and make money. So what is it that makes it so difficult for us at this crucial moment in time to also incentivize financial markets to invest differently, to invest in tomorrow's economy rather than in yesterday's economy? And here is the great debate of our time. How much does the state, how do governments step in? How much do governments also compensate for the fact that markets are not very good at transacting in the interests of the public good? It's not that they are automatically at cross purposes with the public good, but the public good clearly right now demands that we get to a net zero emissions world by 2050. And there is no one who has yet proven to me that markets left to their own devices will do this in time, which is why regulatory and public policy signals need to accelerate the pace of change, give rise to new markets. And frankly speaking, we're already seeing it happen where we put the right measures in place. Renewable energy. We're in the midst of a renewable energy revolution. It is transforming our energy systems, and hundreds of years of relying on fossil fuels are probably 20 to 30 years down the line of becoming really a anachronism. And that's how quickly we can shift, for example, on something like fossil fuels, the lifeblood of our 20th century, 19th century, 18th century economies. And by 2050, I guarantee you, access to electricity, to energy for most people on the planet will be far less of a problem than it has ever been in human history. And that is the kind of economic shift that we need. So encouraging policymakers and legislators begins with citizens, empowered and informed citizens. It then involves governments, and it recognizes how central the rules of the game of our markets are in driving change or preventing change.
Administrator Steiner, I have to say your perspective as an optimist definitely comes through in the Human Development Report. I recall the language about humans as agents, right? Humans as people that have the power and the capacity to produce better for themselves, and that the goal of human development really is about facilitating the conditions to support human freedom and autonomy. And as someone who leads an agency that works with 170 countries around the world for poverty eradication and inclusive society, I want to ask you, how can we create strong partnerships and collaborations across the world to fulfill the promise of the climate agenda, while also, as we face these socioeconomic crises that has been triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic? What are your thoughts on that?
If you would allow me just a brief remark on agency, I think it is a very critical aspect of the 2020 Human Development Report, because, it's very easy for many of us in today's world, the fourth industrial revolution world, the digitalization world, artificial intelligence, everybody talking about systems, complexity, to feel disempowered. And I think this is a very dangerous narrative to pursue. And that's why in the Human Development Report, we try to put so much attention on this notion of agency, the ability to choose, the capabilities to make choices that are different from those that are simply handed down to us. And choices really matter. And, in a recent TED talk, I used the analogy that, systems don't change systems, people change systems. And it is very much with that philosophy or with that paradigm, let's say, in mind, that we approach these, epochal choices that we have to make right now. And you asked me about partnerships. The easiest answer is, the more we work together, the easier it will be. I mean, this is the foundational principle of the United Nations. In 1945, on the ashes of the Second World War, and having learned the bitter lesson of what happens to a world that is capable of self-destruction, even more so after the Second World War, finding both the place, the space, and the ability to work together despite our differences clearly is at the heart of any notion of partnership. And I would begin when we have a challenge such as climate change to remind ourselves that with all the justified criticism of 30 years of climate negotiations, from the Rio 1992 summit through the Copenhagen Climate Convention summit into the Paris Agreement. And yes, here we are in the year 2021 and time is still running out. But at the same time, just imagine for a moment that we didn't have the IPCC over 30 years ago, that kind of rescued science from the dictum of national policy and national interest, that allowed scientists to speak to the world independently about what we knew and what we didn't know about what was happening to our planet. If you then think of the Climate Convention, do you think we would have been worse off or better off if not every year for the past, I think it is now 25 or 26 years, the Climate Convention essentially brought all these countries around the table once a year in the limelight of international attention and showed up the world's nations and leaders for what they were doing or not doing? I think we reached Paris in 2015 because the public saw how much was not being done. And so that partnership, uncomfortable as it is, even in a very political world of a G2 world, China and the US, or Europe and Africa, you can find many reasons to look at the world being very divided. And yet we have a Paris Agreement, we have a pathway to raising ambition levels every 5 years, and hopefully a possibility of aligning where the world is acting with where science is telling us since years we should have acted. So this is one way of thinking about partnership. The other one may be between public sector and private sector. And, frankly speaking, anybody who thinks that the private sector does not or is not needed as a partner in this enterprise of challenging, of addressing the challenge of climate change, loss of biodiversity, simply overlooks the fact that most of the things that happen in our daily lives are transacted not through governments, not through public sector budgets, but through the private sector. And the private sector also is not always corporate, multinational, giant companies. Private sector is the small-scale farmer, it's the corner shop owner, it's the startup enterprise, it's the people who produce most of the world's food today. Small-scale farmers produce over 70% of the food we consume on the planet. So the private sector is essentially that extraordinarily diverse domain that we need to bring along, that we need to incentivize with our consumer choices, with our public policies, with our laws, in order to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And that is perhaps the greatest shift in thinking of our time. Because remember Milton Friedman, it's not so long ago that the credo, the religion of economic correctness was companies have to think about their shareholders and nothing else. We have come a long way and we have paid a heavy price for the time we took to come this long way. But I think we are in many ways at a point in time where the markets of the future, on the one hand, will drive new enterprises and businesses, and where the costs of being rooted in the legacy economy will simply become prohibitive and stranded assets suddenly become a very stark reality. So that is perhaps a way of answering partnerships from multiple perspectives.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Administrator Steiner. So now we're going to questions from the audience. So I have a question here. Actually, you mentioned World War II. So the question is, I wonder if Administrator Steiner could talk about a fourth P, beyond people, planet, and prosperity, that of peace. Could he elaborate on the relationship between climate change and conflict and the importance of building peace while also addressing climate change?
A very appropriate question. And in fact, earlier today, I was co-chairing with my colleague Filippo Grandi and the Director General of Humanitarian Affairs of the EU, the Syria Pledging Conference. Here is a conflict 10 years old, unimaginable suffering and tragedy. Its spillover effects into neighboring countries such as Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, who are hosting millions of refugees. And at a moment in time where their own economies are imploding. I mean, you have all seen the news about Lebanon. So here is one example of how peace is not only a humanitarian catastrophe, it is also a major setback in developmental terms. And the same applies for so many countries in conflict. Yemen, in which UNDP and the United Nations family has now been working for a number of years, almost 7 years, in another protracted conflict. We estimate that Yemen has lost somewhere between 20 to 25 years of its development in these 6 years, just to give you a sense of the setback that conflict causes. Now, many of us have heard, and I think will not be surprised, that if climate change really begins to affect, many of the things that we take for granted, when it rains, when we're able to have enough water to plant, floods, the other extreme, but also temperature variations, sea level rise, extreme weather events, the sheer impact on people and humanity in our economies that we have seen so often in recent years, here in the United States, in the Caribbean, where sometimes a 24-hour event can wipe out 30% of your GDP. This kind of disruption is absolutely anathema to peaceful societies and peaceful development. That doesn't mean that people suddenly turn on one another because of a disaster. But if we allow these pressures to continue, and if we do not prepare for them, then it is quite clear that we will see many more conflicts arising, whether it is upstream, downstream water sharing countries on river basins, whether it is pastoralists who have to essentially change their annual migrations with their livestock and are increasingly clashing with sedentary farming communities, whether it is the waves of migrants who essentially see no future in their countries and are, at the risk of their own lives, moving into other parts of the world, whether it is Central America to North America, whether it is, Africa to Europe. These are the kinds of disruptions that very quickly, when governance systems don't work well, when societies are ill prepared, give rise to tensions, to conflict, to radicalization, to extremism, and a very vicious circle unfolds. And I think another live illustration of this drama is what is playing out in the Sahel region, probably for the better part of the last 20 to 30 years. And if you look forward, unless we truly step in and get to the root causes of this disruption, we will see a great deal more conflict and the absence of peace. So it is, in my mind, very appropriate that we are seeing increasingly in the United Nations the link established between climate change, broader environmental change, and peace and security. Environmental change is threatening international or human security. There is no doubt in my mind. The question is, can we find a 21st century collective response that is not simply rooted in 20th century or simply geopolitical conflicts and competitions? If that is the driving force, then indeed you will continue to witness what you often see right now in the Security Council, in international fora, the inability of governments to provide collective leadership and partnership.
Thank you. We have actually many more questions in the Q&A chat than we're going to be able to proceed to answer, Administrator Steiner. So Professor Dubrow and I will select ones that we think will be most interesting for you. So here's the next one. Will you talk a little bit more about the intersection of environmental justice and planetary health with other systems of oppression that disproportionately impact identity groups? For example, the plight of Gullah Geechee land sustainability in the Gullah Geechee corridor of the United States. The Gullah Geechee are people who are descendants of slaves who've lived along the South Carolina and South Georgia coastal areas. And I think that land is drama with seizing the land for development. So this person is asking, can you talk a little bit more about how those justice and planetary health systems intersect?
Thank you for this question. It is one that takes up a significant amount of time in my thinking, that I think of many of us who work in UNDP, because whether it is through the reality of race, whether it is through poverty and wealth, whether it is through the gender lens, inequalities amplify the impacts of the kinds of changes, environmental changes and impacts that I have described. I earlier mentioned just the example of lead and air pollution, and how, just by virtue of your income, your children very often would be worse affected because of where you had to live. Now, race clearly introduces in many societies another dimension of either discrimination or simply of inadvertently being more vulnerable, more exposed to the impacts of change. Now, I don't know the particular example that the questioner raised just now, but clearly race has played a part here in the United States, for instance, most dramatically illustrated during COVID-19. But if you also look at the basic health data and health statistics across countries such as the United States, but indeed other countries as well, more often than not, there is a parameter, there is a pattern in which racial differentiation allows you to recognize very differential impacts. And so I think understanding the environmental impacts, which are often transacted in terms of scientific indicators and indices, they need to be complemented by, let's say, more social criteria, because it allows us to see not just the physicality of what we're talking about, but the social reality. And that's where the notion of justice becomes so real. Now, justice is invoked in many ways. There is injustice that is associated with inequality. There is injustice with discrimination, and there is injustice simply with negligence that is often associated with the way that governments and societies, at its simplest, really care about all of their citizens. Look at our world today. Access to vaccines is primarily and principally at this moment in time in the year 2021 a function of how much money you have or you do not have. This is the 21st century in which we are still imprisoned by such a crude way of dealing with something that fundamentally offends our sense of justice and fairness. Now, you can take it very quickly to climate justice. For example, speaking in an intergenerational sense, I think to me, what Fridays for Future did more than anything else was to remind me of how privileged I am that I still have the choice to do something about climate change, while perhaps my sons or their children will not even have the choice anymore. So here is a fundamental issue of justice that, again, I think defines the way we need to understand our responsibility to act. And then there is just transition also. Let me give you a dilemma that just a few weeks ago I was addressing with a vice president and the advisory council of an African nation, which was basically trying to look at how to build forward better from COVID-19. And it's a country that has discovered oil, that has still gas reserves, and that essentially posed the question to me, so where is the just transition for us? Because for us, not drilling and not exporting these fossil fuel resources is almost unexplainable to our citizens. So if we were to take a step back, if we were to actually take a leap forward into the green economy, invest in renewables, and perhaps not exploit 50% of our fossil fuel reserves, where is the justice in that, when essentially the industrialized world has spent 200 years, and the United States just in the last 4 years was the world's largest producer of oil and gas? I mean, let us remind ourselves, the largest carbon dioxide emitter over the last 200 years, taken collectively, cumulatively, also was the country that became the largest oil producer in the last 4 years. So if you are a small African economy, where is the just transition that was promised as part of this global climate policy in this world of today? And this is why what we do in the United Nations, whether it's the convention, whether it's UNDP, whether it's the United Nations Environment Programme, we try to address this injustice by finding ways in which a more just transition becomes possible. And the same can be extrapolated right back to a local community. If you have grown up in a coal mining community and tomorrow somebody tells you, it's over, you're not just dealing with shutting a mine. You may find, 20,000 jobs for the people. You're essentially killing a community in the way that it has seen and identified itself for decades sometimes. It's not just money that buys justice here. It's a different sense of what a just transition could mean to that community. So let me stop here, but I think it's a topic that is extremely important. And if we fail or succeed in really meeting the climate challenge, I think it will largely be as a result of finding the right answers to this issue, namely, what is a just transition?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Administrator Steiner. We have time for one more question and probably a fairly short answer. So the question is, with the goal of enabling ordinary people to realize their individual and personal aspirations themselves, how can science be made more usable as a tool for use by ordinary people?
As somebody who was never brilliant at school in the sciences, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question. But let me perhaps share with you a simple lesson in life. And, since I now lead an organization that, has 18,000 people to who I'm answerable, but to who I also have to sound intelligent enough to be able to listen to good scientific advice, I think we need to recognize that, in one person, you will never find everything, whether it is scientific knowledge or whether it is wisdom or whether it is perspective for that matter. It is how you bring people together and how you make collective thinking, collective intelligence work, and how you're able to listen to science not as a dictate, because science also really doesn't answer questions. It provides you input and information in order for us to do what makes us as a human species so unique. We can process information, we can essentially assimilate facts, and then we make choices. We can make judgment calls. Now, sometimes those calls are almost mathematical and the answer is very simple. 2 + 2 is 4. But most of the time in life, I think the thing that I have learned is that science provides me with a reference point. Sometimes, yes, if it's antibiotics, it's also a very simple treatment. But for most of the things that we are trying to deal with in terms of sustainable development, the future of development in this age of the Anthropocene, science is only one dimension of it. And I think we have to accept that, science is a field that is constantly growing exponentially, just like with digitalization and technology. And therefore, specialization is critical. And not all of us, most of us can be those specialists. So the question is, how do we create processes in our society where science continues to inform our thinking and doesn't disenfranchise us? And this is not an easy moment, because scientists know a hell of a lot and certainly know a great deal more than many of us, but they don't necessarily get the right to decide for us. So it is both for the scientists to find ways in which to engage with society about the knowledge that they generate, are privileged enough to have developed on our collective behalf. And it is for us to look for fora in which we can transact science. And at the end of the day, I go back to where we started this afternoon, which is we talk about planetary health. To some, this sounds incredibly complicated, and yet a lot of it is just common sense. And what we are doing with science is informing and empowering people to exercise common sense with the best possible information at our disposal. And that kind of slightly shifts the terms of power here, because there is the temptation for science to become almost a kind of separate universe of decision making. I think that is not in the interest either of science nor of society. And I hope that that is perhaps a way of approaching an answer. It certainly isn't an adequate answer to the question.
Well, yeah, no, that was a great answer. Thank you. And unfortunately, there's this whole question of science that's developed that's, with the anti-vaccination, et cetera, that we won't have time to get into today, but it's another important area related to science. But our time has come to an end, so I wanted to thank you, Administrator Steiner, for a really fantastic conversation today. I'd also like to thank LaRon for co-moderating, Dean Kurth for her welcoming remarks, and you, the audience, for your engagement and insightful questions. So thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event of the YIGH Global Health Conversation Series.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to have you.